hope I won't bore you with this because it's building on the last presentation I gave here. Those of you who were here then might remember that it was about a book that I had read recently prior to that called The Long Strange Trip. It was called Thinking Small, The Long Strange Trip of the Volkswagen Beetle. Keeping in mind we're talking about the old Volkswagen Beetle from the 1960s and 70s, okay? So I wanted to build on that a little bit and personalize it a little bit because it turns out that I and my family and the family business that I grew up in have sort of a relationship with the Volkswagen Beetle. So I thought I would share that with you as well. Just to back up a little bit from that previous speech, I know some of you weren't here. That book was written by a woman named Andrea Hyatt, and she wove a story of the unlikely story of how the Volkswagen Beetle came to be, and came to be unlikely successful, if you will, and especially in this country. And she did that by weaving three different stories of three different people, the first being Ferdinand Porsche, of Porsche Sports Cars, who designed the Volkswagen Beetle, Adolf Hitler, who, when he was in power, wanted to have a people's car. The literal translation in German is Volkswagen. And a guy named Bill Bernbach, who ran an ad agency in New York, so that post-World War II, Volkswagen got revived to build passenger vehicles again, wanted to crack the American market, and hired this guy, Bill Bernbach, of Doyle Dane Bernbach, an ad agency in New York, who came up with this classic ad campaign called Think Small, that went against all the grain of American society at that time, but was hugely successful and launched Volkswagen into this country with the Beetle. Just to follow up a little bit from that, from the global perspective, today Volkswagen is the third largest manufacturer of vehicles in the world. It goes General Motors, Toyota, and Volkswagen. It may seem odd to us because Volkswagen is, while it's a major player here in the United States, it's not a dominant player. It doesn't have a model that's in the top 10 seller or anything like that. But globally, it's huge. And sometimes it switches places. Like a couple of years ago, Toyota had some trouble with recalls and with the tsunami that wiped out some of their supply chain, and they fell into the number 3, and Volkswagen went into the number 2 spot. And I think Toyota edged out General Motors in recent years as well. So that top tier is very, very competitive, obviously. Volkswagen is huge around the world. In Germany, of course, it's number 1. In Europe, it's number 1. They were early into the emerging Chinese market, so they sell a ton of vehicles there, cars and trucks, and yes, they do make trucks. And South America and Africa as well. So globally, it's a huge company, and they have the stated goal of being the number 1 manufacturer in the world by, I think, 2020 or 2018 or something like that. So anyway, that's sort of the global picture, and I want to zoom in both in theme and in time to back in the late 1960s when I was in high school, back in the antediluvian days. And some of you may have heard me say this, that I grew up, my father ran an automobile repair business. And this is the business that my older brothers and I grew up in. And he worked on everything from big trucks to passenger vehicles. He had an International Harvester dealership for a while. They used to make trucks and SUVs. That's no longer in business. And so he did all these various things, but it was primarily a repair business. And one day in the shop I was working, I think it was after school, and what was happening at that time was more and more of my father's customers were, Volkswagen had kind of hit the big time and they were selling a lot of Volkswagen Beetles, so more and more of our customers had Volkswagen Beetles. And we did simple maintenance type things with them, so tires and oil changes and inspections and wiper blades and all the sort of routine things that the cars need to keep going. But my father never liked foreign cars, and he never wanted to work on them. He thought that they were small, which equated with junk, and that they were cheaply made, unreliable pieces of junk, basically. He had not much use for them, and he certainly didn't want to work on them. But we did this sort of maintenance things to keep our customers happy. One day I was working there, and I think it was after school, and I was working alone in the shop, and one of my assignments was one of our customers had brought in her Volkswagen Beetle. She was a woman in her 50s, real nice lady, had dropped off her Beetle for an oil change, and my job was to do the oil change. So I put the car up on the lift, drained the oil, put the car down, and got interrupted multiple times with people coming in, this sort of thing. And I forgot to fill the car up with oil, the engine back with oil. The poor lady came in, picked up her car, drove about 4 miles, and the engine seized up. So we got the car back into the shop, realized that the engine had no oil in it. Of course, it's my fault. I felt like an idiot, and I was an idiot. And I had offered to pay for it out of my pocket. My father said, no, you know, this was a mistake, but he would make it good. And how he made it good was he and my older brother pulled the engine out of that Volkswagen and rebuilt it for the lady. And she was very understanding about it, and she basically got a new engine in her car, and it was an expensive mistake for me. And so she was happy, everybody was happy. The ironic and unintended consequences of that were that I wasn't a mechanic at that point in my life, but my father and brother learned how to work on those things by doing that in a big way. I mean, major repairs on them. And that became a big part of the business. It became known in the area. We were a rural area in northern New Hampshire, keeping in mind that a dealer was an hour plus away in Portland, Maine, or Portsmouth, New Hampshire, somewhere like that. So this became, if you had a Volkswagen Beetle and you had trouble with it, you could take it to Forbes's and they would fix it. So that became a big part of the business. Moreover, at that time, the Japanese cars were coming in. So people were buying not just Volkswagen Beetles, but Toyotas and Nissans and Hondas and Subarus and all of those. So that became part of the business as well, to work on foreign cars, much as my father didn't like foreign cars. But it was good business. So the other sort of unintended consequence of it was that, and sort of a final irony to it from my perspective, a few years later, I was in college, and a guy came around from Volkswagen and talked to my father about becoming a dealer, a Volkswagen dealer. And the guy did it in sort of an obnoxious way, because he said, my father didn't like him. The guy came in and said, do you think you have enough money to buy a Volkswagen franchise? And my father said, I don't want a Volkswagen franchise. He didn't have anything to do with it. And I always thought that that was a mistake, because, and of course it was his business, his call totally, and I certainly didn't, I was away at college anyway, certainly wasn't going to dispute it. But I always thought that was a mistake, because there was no dealer anywhere around, you know, within 60 miles or so. And people were snapping these things up. They were like the Subaru of their day, because American cars had a big heavy iron block engine in the front driving the rear wheels, and they were terrible in the snow. But Volkswagen had the aluminum block engine over the rear wheels, driving the rear wheels, and they were great in the snow. So people liked them, and people just liked them. They had some drawbacks. They didn't have very much heat in the cabin, and you didn't have much of a defroster, little things like that. But people liked them anyway. So anyway, I thought that would have been a good opportunity if he had jumped on that, because I think that would have been a lucrative business for one thing, and I think that he was well placed there in that area to really have it, the market to yourself kind of thing. But nevertheless, one of my brothers really got into it. I've only owned 2 of them. I own a Volkswagen now. It's on a Beetle, and I had one back in the 80s. But one of my older brothers, the guy that rebuilt the engine, really got into it. He had 2 or 3 of them. He'd buy and sell them used and that sort of thing. And he had a growing family, so he drove a Volkswagen, the minibus, for a while too. It was great for hauling his kids around in. But anyway, that's the sort of personal side of my involvement and my family's involvement with the Volkswagen. Thank you.